Welcome everyone to a little poetry session with Jacques Rancourt. Um, it's such a pleasure to be able to leverage some of the awesome connections that we have as alumni and to read this really cool work that talks about something that touches our community very deeply. And I think that what we're trying to do in BiGLATA is just give us a range of experiences that we can all share. So thank you for joining us today. I'm going to introduce Jacques, who's an amazing poet. Hopefully you've all bought the book. If not, do it. To read some of the poems from the book, and then we're going to talk about it, and then also get a chance to meet each other. So thank you for attending, and Jacques, without further ado, please take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Mijan and Zarelli, for helping to organize this event. I'm so excited to be reading for you all. And I am not myself a alumni of Williams. I am married to alumni of Williams, but I am wearing the correct colors. So, wanted to make sure I got that right at least. I thought I would begin by reading not a poem of my own, but a poem that kind of speaks to what is going on in the world right now. And this is a poem that's been shared quite a bit on Twitter and social media in the last few days. It's by a Ukrainian-American poet, Ilya Kaminsky. And though it was published back in 2013, it speaks really apropos to what's going on today. And it's not necessarily a poem of hope, but sort of a warning against complacency in times of strife. So I'll begin by reading this before jumping into my own poems. But this is called "We Lived Happily During the War." And when they bombed other people's houses, we protested, but not enough. We opposed them, but not enough. I was in my bed. Around my bed, America was fallen. Invisible house by invisible house by invisible house. I took a chair outside and watched the sun. In the 6th month of a disastrous reign, in the house of money, in the street of money, in the city of money, in the country of money, our great country of money, we, forgive us, lived happily during the war. All right, so I will be reading from my new book, Brocken Spectre. And for those of you who don't know what a Brocken Spectre is, it's a natural occurrence that occurs in high altitude mountains, typically, where the mist and the light interact in such a way that it will cast your shadow and enlarge it. So it sort of looms over you in a large way and is haloed by rainbow light. And the reason I titled this book Brocken Spectre is this is a book about one's history sort of looming over us and sort of thinking about the ghosts that walk among us ever presently. And so I'm going to read a few poems from the book. And the first poem I'm going to read is a triptych. It's in 3 parts, and it's sort of about the confluence of desire and death, and the way that the past and history and moves through, as we move through places, how the past and history lives among us. So this is called A Triptych of Our First Date, in which a man dies from cardiac arrest. 1. We walk through a park better known for its pleasures. At night, the bushes barely conceal what took place behind them. Pants slumped, anchored down by belt buckles. Earlier in our game of searching the ground for spent condoms, we come across the baby rattler, side-winding over the dirt, and the ranger who tells us they're more venomous when they're young. I want something timeless. I want you to tell me I could be more than just a body, more than just what you could leave behind. Though months will pass before I learn you do not believe in the soul. That force that meant, I thought, we can make peace with the past, so long as its ghosts don't inhabit a place. That meant we could blend into one another like the air that fills this park from new leaves. Burgeoning with sex, or the hope for it, that fills my lungs when I take your hand, while behind us, a man collapses, just as you are about to speak. 2. When I recall what Lucretius wrote, that nothing comes from nothing, I do not think anything of the sapling sprung up from out the dead oak. Nor do I wonder why these midnight cruisers no longer lurk behind these trunks, cupping their crotches as if presenting a gift. Nor if their semen might still thread beneath us like roots. Nor how a man's face could be transfigured by the moonlight's shifting pattern through the old growth groves. Nor why the rangers thinned out this forest one stalk at a time. Nor how this park sits where a tribe once lived, before the Spanish king gifted the land to the man who killed them. At the heart of every creation myth, ex nihilo, out of nothing. And though a universe of zero size, one argument goes, comes as close to nothing as we can get, it is still not nothing. 3. In an emergency, it's important, I'll learn months later, to first establish rank. I'm a physician, I'm a nurse. Someone calls an ambulance, someone offers you relief when, after 5-10 minutes of pumping his chest, the man's heart remains still. Months later, you'll tell me that in medical school, they train you to perform CPR to the rhythm of the Bee Gees. Months later, I'll confess that watching you drive your weight so hard that his ribs all snap at once, they're snapping, filling the distance between us, that this was when I first loved you. It's wrong, I know, to fall in love with someone while someone else is dying, in a park that's turned its face to spring, or before reaching out to hold your hand just as his heart halted and every remaining living thing spurred into motion. I used to be a principal of a middle school, and the school was off this major highway that was where they had a strip of lawn that was on this the merge that where the grass was never mowed and grew incredibly high, and so it was a very treacherous merge because you can never see the onslaught of oncoming traffic until you pretty much were already in their lane. And so this poem, it kind of imagines an accident at the spot in the opening stanza. So this is called As Weather. Because at night, the goldenrod and snake grass obscure the oncoming cars from behind their gold, the cars seem to come bolt from nowhere. That place where tragedy is ripped from. That place I'll visit at the very end of my life. The car bolted from nowhere and rear-ended mine, shoving it up and over and through the guardrail into a cove of sapling eucalyptus. Studies show just by walking through a eucalyptus grove, under its strips of peel and bark, its exposed stalks the color of chicken bones. Subjects reported feeling noticeably happier, as if happiness is a state you could enter through the gates of its kingdom. My grandfather, for most of his life, had a recurring dream of flying over the Pacific, looking down at his shadow crossing over waves in the dark mounds of Wales. He always woke before reaching his destination, but he said, days before he died, I feel like I'm getting close. There must be somewhere his terror goes, or sorrow, or love. They must evaporate like sweat off skin and return eventually as weather. All that remains of fire after it burns down a forest, ashy smudges tucked between the rings of trees, bruises that never heal, screams pressed like petals between the pages of history, where once I tried to write some lines in an attempt to save my life, which, having done so, I could not forsake. I grew up incredibly Catholic. There was a Catholics who go to church once a week, and there was a Catholics who go to church every day, and I came from that group. And one of our sort of lead-in icons grown up was Our Lady of Fatima. It's one of the modern visitations of the Virgin Mary and miracles of the 20th century. And so I wrote this next poem sort of imagining one of the children who received this vision, grown older, and questions of faith and doubt and ego and memory creeping in. So this is sort of told through the perspective of Sister Lucia Santos. And it's in 24 sections, so it's a bit of a longer one. It's called In Fatima. 1. In Fatima in 1917, a woman in white, more brilliant than the sun, visited 3 children herding sheep. 2. What she said in this vision, the voice firm and feminine, the Virgin Mary's, only confirmed what the children already deemed to be true. 3. That they were special. 4. And if they doubted what they saw, which they did not, they had only to kneel in the Portuguese field. 5. Which had been wet, but now was dry. Which had been verdant, but now was scorched. 6. Or to look at the bodies of the cattle that lay struck down on the hill like bales of hay. 7. Lucia, the oldest, was 9. 8. And this woman who once gave birth to the Son of God on her side between 2 goats asked her to spread a warning. 9. And she was too afraid to say no. 10. The miracle seemed to be that the townspeople believed the children. 11. But in truth, they did not. Not really. 12. Despite the signs, despite the fact they believed that God did live and could speak in mysterious ways. 13. When their warning changed nothing and bombs still bludgeoned craters towards the earth's heart. 14. After the 2 younger children had died from influenza and their cast-off bodies were buried sideways. 15. When Lucia had become an old woman, nearly 100 years old, after a whole history had passed her by. 16. She began to doubt the visions, the fever dreams she shared in those afternoons of childish ecstasy. 17. The nettle branches with which they had flailed their backs, the boiling water with which they had scored their skin. 18. Why hadn't the woman ever come back? 19. Now Lucia wonders if these memories are all merely shadows of herself, changing in the cloud patterns, like hands wringing out a damp, cold cloth. 20. That God existed, she never doubted. 21. But he watches over us from space like a meteor in orbit. 22. Or the large, sad eye of Jupiter. 23. Truth be told, even now, she feels as important and alone as space. 24. Despite its stars, despite its occasional flares of violence. The next poem I'm going to read is a poem about the soul, and it's called Monster Cock. They're not allowed to be completely nude. I recall in a deserted gay bar when a go-go dancer, wearing full camo, combat boots, a patrol hat, inside a glass cube where a shower head drenches him whole, pulls out a cock roughly the size of my forearm. This reminds me of your patient, the homophobe, who desperately needed a liver transplant and got one when that night's winner of the big dick contest in the Castro slipped off a bar stool while getting sucked off, hit his head against concrete, and died. In this bar, the dancer faces only me and the $5 bill I cup. And because the bar is empty, I avoid eye contact. It's one of the unspoken rules, casting me as Orpheus tulling up the layers of hell, as Lot's wife among the steel beams corroded by salt. But because I still somehow believe in the soul, which transcends the body and triumphs over death, which lingers over everything like the cold, dense fog that settles on the city, I chance a glance at his eyes under his hat's wide brim, through the shower's downpour, even though I shouldn't, even though he thumps the heavy meat of his cock against the glass. Yes, this is a true story. Walter would like everyone to know. There really was a homophobe who got a well-endowed man's organs. Speaking of, so this next poem I'm going to read is a poem I wrote the day before Walter and I got married, and I slipped inside his jacket pocket before the ceremony. And in a lot of ways, Brocken Spectre is, one of the arcs of Brocken Spectre is a love poem, and thinking about, you know, the fortune of where in history we have emerged as queer people, and thinking about what had to happen to get us to this point, and thinking about the sacrifices of so many of generations of queer activists to arrive in the 21st century to enjoy the privileges that we enjoy here in America, but still have many more to fight towards. And so that's sort of one of the considerations sort of how to carry history with us through this relationship and through love. So this poem's title comes from Whitman, from actually a poem that Walter and I had read at our wedding ceremony. It's a Song on the Open Road, and the line from which the title is drawn is, "The earth is rude, silent, incomprehensible." Now that we exist on the other side of desire, when I tell you I love you, I mean we live on a planet that's dying. And it's no accident that the calla lily is both a symbolic flower for weddings and for funerals. I told you that loons mated for life, and when one died, the other spent her days calling out to him across the gray pond. Once again, you see, I was wrong. Look, I will be honest with you. When I promised myself, I did so knowing not even the sun lasts forever. Look, the future is pressing itself so closely against us, it has already passed us by. And to die must make the same sound as a woman I watched during a rainstorm thrashing a river with a branch. Could we make time pass a little more slowly? I want to watch the fireflies spark up the tall grass, and the bullfrog that unrolls its wide, fat tongue 1,000 frames per second, thwap the fly that flickers before it with its honey-thick spit. The next few poems I'm going to read are from another thread of this book, which considers our position in the 21st century to the HIV/AIDS crisis. And as someone who was born in 1987, which is the year that so many of these the first treatments became available, my relationship to the crisis was, of course, different than someone who's lived through it. And thinking about what it means to be a second generation survivor, what it means to make space for that, for the lives lost and for the tragedies that unfolded, and how to carry that history with us, and to not forget, and to not to let go of the past, and to learn from it, and to hold space for it. So these poems sort of consider the schism of generations, and the lack of queer mentorship due to a generation that was all but wiped out. And so the first poem I'm going to read in this sort of series is Golden Gate Park. Tonight, walking the AIDS memorial, I think about the man who hydrated his partner by feeding him ice chips with his mouth. Someone stumbles down the path, maybe drunk, maybe a little fucked up, and I know not to make eye contact, not to stop, but I do stop. This man wants to fuck right here and now on top of the red earth. Back east, where I grew up, the past persists, sinister as a forest. A man hit on another man in a rural bar, and thus was beaten with a cast iron pan, laid across the tracks, and severed by a train. Here, his lips still sweet from the clove he smoked, this stranger kisses me like those men of our father's generation, who'd rendezvous in parks past dark. Never again will I destroy the earth by fire, God told Noah after the sun broke through, the covenant signed in rainbow. Once I believed in God, convinced that the earth was his own beaten heart. I talked to him out loud in the forest at night. I felt endless then, and knowing I wasn't only enlarged me. It's pretty bad when you can't find your own poem in your own book. There it is, though. So this next poem I'm going to read is called The Wake, and it's I've untraditionally used periods, so I've put periods where they don't belong to cut up the sentences and to create multiple meanings. So when I read this out loud, I'll give pause those breaks. So it'll be a little stuttery. This is it's called The Wake. What seemed necessarily bleak became two wet cormorants filling the branch of one tree. More than just wading birds, more than just a lake, a dark scar at the center of my city. More than anything, I wanted to forget a time when desire named its price in summer. Two hummingbirds take turns sucking one beard tongue dry. Then I was born. I say, in a place between two hills. The year AZT was released. When I checked the records, I was relieved that no one shared exactly my name. That migration might mean the birds won't come back. That 636,000 of us died, and I did not know a single one. when I was writing my first book, which is a sort of queer Bildungsroman, coming of age book of poems, I showed it to another queer poet who advised me to not write those kinds of poems because queer people weren't experiencing the kind of struggle with coming out that I was writing about or that I experienced. And I took issue with that as I feel like that gets very whitewashed and myopic take on what queer people are going through and young queer people today. So this next poem I wrote is sort of about the ways in which, yes, progress has happened in America, and then the ways in which it looks exactly the same. The struggles look exactly the same. So this is called Near the End of the Century. It's 1987, by which I mean I've been born, though barely. While in the heart of Harlem, strutters peck down a runway and speakers fray on about love. Park benches with no street lamps, examination rooms with no rubber bands to bulge the veins blue. Time is elastic. Either it's 1994, or it's 1980, or it was just last night. It makes no difference. Someone slips out the back screen porch of their parents' home for the last time. Someone leaves behind everything they know about how this will end to the future, to stand outside those warehouse doors, bass crushing their chest. They might be a vision if they could enter. They might reapply mascara in the greased bathroom mirror or duck walk the runway, their hands, two birds bickering above their hair. They might make out with a ghost. They might twirl like a disco ball, spraying every person in this room with flecks of lit glass, until the host, clacking fans with both hands, declares, the old world has passed away. Behold, all things have been made new. But for now, it's not yet the end of the century, by which I mean they have no reason not to believe her. I'm going to read just two more poems. This next poem is called Voyeur. Whatever I expected, it was not that the dungeon would be stone quiet, that the men pacing the halls for sex would be polite. They, like me, came out after, while in the center pool, the older men soak. These tunnels, dark and damp, industrial steel halls that snake, offer doors with slots for passerby to watch, where inside men wait. I wanted to see if the bathhouse would permit me. If walking this labyrinth would be like walking into the past. Or like when a storm rolled in over the hills, how I watched from underwater for rain to break the river's ceiling. The men in the pool, the ones who remember, they lift themselves in and out. They are like a council of stars that blew from underneath. They laugh silently and touch each other, or float on their backs, staring up at the show of light on the ceiling. They lean their heads against each other as water drips and purls from their soft arms, half in this world, half in another. And for a long time, behind the grill's steel grate, I watched them. And the last poem I'm going to read is the final poem in the book. It's called Love in the Time of Prep. And I don't think I need to explain this to this group of folks, but in case you don't know, PrEP is a daily pill one can take to reduce the odds of contracting HIV. And the title obviously makes reference to the Marquez novel, Love in Time of Cholera. To see more clearly, we climb the shifting sands of Haleakala volcano. The guidebook says we might be haunted if the mist and the light are just right. And sure enough, a rainbow halos my head's shadow. Brocken Spectre it's called. And isn't this awesome? You, my dorky husband, say. You are thinking about science again, about how light and water particles bounce and interact and refract against each other. Whereas I, the melodramatic poet, see some paranormal visitor, some queer saint. Back home in bed, you tell me how in the early 90s, to you coming out meant either you killed yourself or you died from AIDS, and you chose to come out anyway. Time moves like bluffs, like erosion. It flattens to rift and split. It carves down the precipice like the runoff we clambered up to find the path already deteriorated. I hiked in just flip-flops, and when a thon broke, I hiked in bare feet. Let's go back someday. Let's go back to where the ocean's panorama was endless and shimmering, where the violets bursting forth were reminders that the world will go on generously without us. In bed, I kiss you between your shoulder blades and say, I'm glad you're here. North of us, 2 freshmen are skipping class. They are learning. They are taking turns, taking each other raw, as if they alone are discovering something new. As if none of this ever happened. Thank you all very much for being here and listening.
All right, so now we are doing the Q&A portion. Jacques, thank you so much for reading the poems to us, and then also for writing this work. I think that I think in both of the breakout rooms that I was a pleasure to be a guest in, we were talking so much about how it's interesting that you chose to write about this given your proximity to the HIV/AIDS crisis. Was that something that you were thinking about when you were doing the work, or were you just like writing poems and like they all just happened to like fall into this category?
A little bit of both. I think initially the poems were ones that I sort of one-off, was exploring, this idea of this chasm I felt in the queer community. As I talked to queer people who were younger than me, who had even less relationship to the crisis years and had a sort of amnesia about it, or had a sort of this complete disconnect from it. And sort of being in this in-between generation where like I remember distinctly growing up to alongside the news cycles and the fear of the epidemic on kind of as part of my growing up as a queer person, my queer narrative. And so I wanted to like write poems that spoke to that sort of gap that I experienced. And so eventually, at first it which is a few poems I wrote, but there's so many questions that those poems raised for me that led me to other poems. And eventually I wrote, 40 or 50 pages of these poems, which only a few made it to this book. But it sort of kind of ballooned from there. So I would say it's actually a little bit of both.
Yeah. And when you were envisioning these poems, do you think of them more as something that people would read quietly to themselves or spoken out loud?
I love that question because the history of poetry is, of course, an oral tradition, right? It's sort of where poetry and music has their common ancestor, right? And poems were memorized and spoken to in courts and obviously, before things were written down. And so some part of poetry should always, I think always should be space for it to be spoken out loud and for events like this. But also in the same hand, one of the great pleasures of poetry is the experience of being able to read it in isolation and in solitude, and to kind of live with the words in a way that um, you can do in private. Like it's a private interior way to build up your interior life, and also I find especially poems that are denser, it's so nice to go back and through. Like when I read poems, I often don't read just one at a time. I'll go back and reread the poem 4 or 5 times, just to kind of let it sink with you, since they do tend to be so condensed and so take up so little space that sometimes you need a few reads to kind of soak in what's happening. But that said, it's been a number of poets. I think particularly of the poet Carl Phillips, who I felt like I couldn't read his work. I couldn't understand his work until I heard him read it out loud. And then I could go back with his cadence and his voice and reread the poems and understand better what they were accomplishing. So I think there's always going to be a bit of a advantage to both.
Yeah. And obviously this is a very indulgent question, but what is your editing process?
Yeah, for the book or for the individual poems?
I guess both.
Okay, sure. A long one. I usually I'm usually working on 6 or 7 poems simultaneously. I rarely would consider a poem done until I let it sit in a drawer for 6 months, pull it out again, and see if I have any comments on it. If after 6 months I pull it out and it still feels fresh to me, and I don't have things I need to tweak, then I consider it more or less ready to go. That rarely happens. Usually when I pull it out, I'm like, oh gosh, this is trash, and then I change everything. So it's this constant, it takes me a while. Some poems in this book were I tweaked on for over a decade. And one in particular, Faith, is the oldest poem in this book, which is a poem I did not read tonight, but it's a poem of rhyming couplets. And the earliest drafts go back to 2011. And every year I found something else to kind of like, get it to update or to try to sound more closer to what I had envisioned. The book editing process was interesting because this book was actually taken in 2018. So I had almost 3 years to gesticulate before it made its way to the world. And with that much time, you're going to kind of really obsess over every detail of it. My publisher, they're super great. The editing process was very collaborative. And they asked me to make a document tracking every change I made since the publication acceptance to the final version. I think I gave them like a 15-page document because I just kept tweaking all these lines, and probably to their chagrin. But they were very receptive to all these changes.
Mm-hmm. And when you were I guess creating Brocken Spectre, I mean, obviously you did it over a length of time, but were you envisioning them as a collection, or is it, or like how did you, was it like accidental or organic that these poems coalesced into one work?
A little bit of both. Once again, so before I published Brocken Spectre, I published a chapbook of poems called "In the Time of Prep," and that was a very deliberate project. Right, I was writing poems about the HIV/AIDS crisis and our relationship to it in the 21st century. The poems were, as I mentioned earlier, some of them kind of came to me just what I was interested in, what sparked my interest. But eventually, it almost became like a project I took on through research and trying to kind of write my way to the answers to some of the questions I was asking, or to the questions my questions were questioning. And so that project was very much sealed and was a deliberate act. With the rest of the collection, so Brocken Spectre has maybe 12 poems in that chapbook in it. And I didn't think I was writing a collection at the time. I had these poems that didn't fit the chapbook, and so I just kind of kept them off to the side, my little side bay that I was working on. And one summer, I just kind of threw them all together to see what would happen. I arranged them alphabetically, and I showed them to a friend, and asked them, is this a book? I don't know. It's how do the poems about the crisis interact with poems about my growing up, or poems about, hooking up with a stranger in a pond, for example, is one of the poems does. And I found that actually I was interested by some of the arguments that were made in the book by juxtaposition in a poem about the crisis years and a poem about, queer desire, or a poem like Monster Cock, or, these poems that weren't so deliberately about a historical moment, or our relationship to a moment, but more globally about how things shadow over us, or how history looms over us. And so I actually felt when I did that, what made it work for me was that the poems deepened each other. And so then from that point, even though I didn't set out to write a book that was going to merge the chapbook with new poems, they seemed to complicate each other in a way that pushed the work forward. And so I let that fly.
Well, I mean, I think that we all share this from reading your poem, is that they resonate very, very deeply with just thoughts and that one might have growing up as a queer person. One poem that you didn't, I don't think you read this to us, but you wrote about the shooting that happened in Orlando. And it's so funny because I think what you captured so well was that feeling of like, I'm not there, but I'm there.
Mm-hmm.
And is that something that comes up a lot in your work? Just like almost like reverberating what happens to other queer people through yourself?
In part, I think part of the role of the poet is to imagine their ways through other perspectives and other moments, into, I think that's the work of the poet, but it's also the work of us as empathists, right? To think of, to think our way into in tragedy or into heartbreak. And so, that poem in particular is interesting because, well, I think at some level that is what's happened, and it's also sort of about one's callousness, right? And how one can become hardened against tragedy, and lose that sense of empathetic connection with others, and to live in a time when shootings are so frequent that one's to feel something, or feel enough, right, when this happens. And so that was an interesting poem to write, exploring that angle as well, and trying to write my way towards what it means to grow callous to tragedy.
Yeah, I mean, because I was reading it, and it was like, today when I go to Safeway to buy lettuce, I discover I have no heart. And it was just like, I was like, that was the perfect way of capturing that, like, you feel numb even if you're not there.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, that sort of distance, emotional distance, but also physical distance.
Mm-hmm.
And numbness too, as a way of processing tragedy too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's almost too much to bear when you hear news like that. It doesn't even feel real, right?
Yeah, and it's like, I think as people in the pandemic, we're so often living our lives as like voyeurs.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's stuff happening in the world and we're not a part of it,
Mm-hmm.
but we are a part of it because we're in that world. So Eric had a really lovely question. In reading, I think it's voyeur or yoyer, you changed old men to older men. Was that a spontaneous edit to be more PC?
Not to be more PC, I would say, but I do tend to find that I do edit my poems in real time. And part of that is, like whenever I find, like I have my poems, like I generally know what they say. Of course, I wrote them, but sometimes when I'm making eye contact with an audience or with a webcam, and you look back down to where your place, you have your thumb placed, and you're like, oh, that's not quite what it said here. That was a moment such as that.
No, I mean, but I do, I think as we all get older, older sounds better than old.
Sure.
No, but what was it that Dan said? Um, do, do, do. So, so I think what many people will gather from reading this book is how um, being born in the 80s, even if you didn't know people personally that died of HIV/AIDS, there was like this almost like reverberation that was happening, and that you felt it. Um, you felt that like that was part of your history in a way that was like I don't think that people probably feel today. You know, like now there's PrEP, now people are having bareback sex, like there's just like, whoa, everything's like really crazy. For me, being born in the 80s. But how much do you think that affected your approach to this work?
I mean, I think that's one of the questions or one of the things I wanted to write into, one of the gulfs I wanted to write into, that exact disconnect, right? And you know, my generation being one that's sort of lost at sea a bit, you know, like in the sense that like, you know, my first understanding coming from rural Maine of what it meant to be queer was what it meant to die, right? Like my very first encounter with queerness wasn't Will and Grace, wasn't Glee, it wasn't people I knew. It was the news. It was what was happening to our community in the early '90s, and that that leaves a shadow that's very I think that's very unique to my generation, and is to grow up as children knowing that you are something else, and to see what that something else is, what they're going through and what kind of scourge they're experiencing. Um, and I do think the younger generation, the generation now that's coming of age, don't doesn't have quite that connection to the crisis years, though however recent they've been. And there's a liberation and freedom that they experience, and I think for the most part that's a very positive thing. Um, However, I think part of the book purpose, part of the reason why I was drawn to write these poems was this kind of I don't know. I feel this necessity to remember and to hold space for what happened, because I think it's so important for us to hold that history as close as we can.
And so why was Brocken Spectre such a I guess a homing beacon for this collection of poems?
Yeah, so I wrote the last before I had the title for this book. I wrote the last poem in it, which mentions the Brocken Spectre. Um, and when I was thinking about what work that was metaphorically doing in that poem, I just sort of lingering over this lumen above, this idea of well, of course, the rainbow halo is already a gay image, right? um, and but also this idea of like um, having one's ghost appear at large, hanging over you. Um, and I felt that image was appropriate for that poem. But then when I thought about it and how these poems interact, the ones about the crisis years and the ones that are not about the crisis year, that's where the thread that holds them together is this idea of the past, the recent past, looming over and at large, um, and trying to kind of pay attention um, to those ghosts, right? And to listen, to make space to listen to those ghosts and what they have to say.
Thank you for the Wikipedia link, Walter. Um, um, so what I also, I mean, so I'm a as someone that appreciates literature in general, I do think that in reading your work, it reminds me of like, reading what was that James Baldwin book? Um, I can't remember. Giovanni's Room, um, and even if like you weren't trying to do this. Like there's something very courageous about capturing some of these very like taboo moments, like going, you know, in a bar with like this like stripper that has like an enormous penis, or like going to a bathhouse. So in choosing to do this work, is it like a political statement for you, or is it like, or are you just trying to capture like parts of your life?
Yeah, I had one reader refer to this book as an attempt to shock the bourgeois. I was like, fair. Let them be shocked. No, I don't know if I honestly am not one of those folks. I don't really think about audience when I write. Obviously, the question of audience comes in later in the process, but I think I do try to write poems that are honest to my own perspective of the world and my own place in the world, and my own experience of moving through this world. And so, I think, and I think queer life is still very shocking to the bourgeois, right? Like the experiences of being a queer person in this world is still, against the grain of normality, right? Like that's what it means to be a queer person, per bell hooks, right? Like this idea that like not necessarily who we sleep with, but just kind of being at odds with society. And so yeah, I think part of that was just sort of describing that experience from my own perspective, at least, of what queer life looks like, and trying to make a snapshot of this moment in time.
That's so great. No, I, but it's like, I guess like in reading it, like I was like, oh wow, like this is like real life. Like, what was so funny is like, so one thing that is a kind of constant is that a lot of times like the speaker of your poems tends to be a voyeur. Is that like a constant theme in your work?
I think so. There was a review that came out a week ago that made the claim that the speaker of this poem was like a witness through the mist, right? And it's like it used this metaphor of trying to clear the mist. And I really appreciated the way that writer described the book. And I think that's something I don't think I was consciously playing with, but I now looking back, now the book's been out, and a few folks have shared their perspectives on it. I start to see that this idea of of being a voyeur to history, of being a voyeur to queerness, of being a voyeur to relationships. And something this reviewer pointed out was that the reader, as a result, becomes a voyeur on the relationship that's described throughout the book. And again, I really appreciated that perspective, as it wasn't one, because of course it's my life, so it doesn't seem voyeuristic to me, but then it's interesting to think about putting the reader into that position of a voyeur as well as the speaker who feels to be a voyeur to history.
Yeah, there's definitely an element of like, so the speaker of the poem feels like a voyeur, and then as readers we're voyeurs, so we're almost like being voyeurs together.
Yes, arm in arm.
um, and so then just in terms of like in phrasing, so in some of your poems like it's just a standalone, and other ones are in parts. So what I guess as you're writing, like what makes you choose to do things in like like a three-part poem versus just like one holistic place?
I love that question. So today I read two sequences. I read the triptych and I read the Fatima poem. The Fatima poem was always meant to be in parts. It was inspired by a poem by Anne Carson that's in 52 parts. That's a hybrid essay. It's an essay poem, poetic essay. And I wanted to sort of capture that sense of like writing, not as being concerned with the tightness of language, and kind of writing more freely the way of an essay would, and doing it in compartments, and what those compartments could hold. The triptych was interesting because the third section of the triptych was a poem I wrote in 2015 or so. And the first and second, were the very last poems I wrote for the book right before I had to hand in my final edits. And that experience of never being quite satisfied with the third section as a standalone poem, it actually didn't even make the final version of the book when I submitted it for publication. But then, you know, to continue digging into that idea and to like sort of, you know, the scene describes someone collapsing in the park and dying, and to take another stab at that scene from a different perspective, right? Kind of illuminated something for me in the poem that then allowed me to write my way to that second, more philosophical section of what it means to be in a place where tragedy has occurred, and thinking about, you know, all the way through the beginning, you know, what is the beginning, and can there be a universe without anything, right? Those kind of more philosophical questions where I was able to lean into once I had this sort of book-ended perspective of this event. So that's a long answer to your question, but that's just an interesting example though of a poem that I sort of like kind of dug into almost 5 years later to try to still figure out how to make that moment work.
And I think this will be our final question, but just as someone that is like creating work, what do you think is like something that like inspires you to keep creating?
Wikipedia. It's amazing how Wikipedia has really opened the world to us, right? In a way that keeps the poems churning. But you know, I think one of the hard things about the pandemic has been this sort of inability to experience life in a way that translates easily to poetry, right? You know, I think so much of my work has a narrative thread that's driven out of personal experience, and to really slow down those personal experiences has been hard to write from, right? And so, you know, it's cheesy to say, but you know, I think life is what has fueled my work, and sort of this exploration of what it means to be human, right? Whether that's through trying to better understand science in a poetic way, or trying to better understand one's position in history, or trying to figure out like how these things all fit together in from your own personal perspective too. So yeah, that's how I would answer that.
And we have a little another question. So it's clear that you have a relationship with Walt Whitman. Sorry, Walter.
The first Walt in my life.
Yeah. What is that relationship, and how has that influenced your work?
That's a great question. Yes, Whitman is definitely one of my touchstone poets, in a way that I have battled with Whitman my entire life as a poet. Like, I have been frustrated with him. I have adored him. I read some of myself every single year, and some years it's been the most altering experience. In some years I have just wanted to throw the book across the room, because I think I don't know, I don't think he can get away with what he thinks he can get away with.
He's very frustrating and also awesome.
Yeah, my relationship to poetry and to him has evolved as I have evolved, and so, you know, I have a poem in this book called Against Whitman, right? Like, where I'm arguing with him about his sense of ease about the afterlife, right? And I thought Whitman was a interesting person to sort of lean against while writing this book, because of his relationships to the Civil War, and you know, him writing about a split America through this exploration of death and nature and beauty. And that's not too dissimilar from what I'm doing in Brocken Spectre as well. This idea of chasms, this idea of disconnection between brothers, right? In this case, queer folks. And I'm so glad that Eric, you mentioned at the place of bathhouses, the ending of that poem is a direct reference to The Swimmers by Walt Whitman. And there's a number, I mean, there's 4 or 5 places in this book that directly are are taken from Whitman, even when I don't acknowledge that as directives. I do, and for instance, the earth is rude, silent, incomprehensible. But I think Whitman will always be someone I am writing against, for, towards, with, alongside.
Well, there's definitely a strong theme of Americana in your work, and like Walt Whitman is like definitely like one of the strong Americana poets. So it runs true.
Yeah.
Well, so Jacques, thank you so much. This work is phenomenal, and we're really glad that we were able to hear it from your person. Thank you, everyone, for coming here today. Also, I just want to do a little shameless plug because BiGLATA is working on trying to do a live event in person that will be happening across the country all at the same time in various locations. So if you are interested in partaking, or maybe in helping to be one of the on the spot people, just like a point person, please reach out, because we're hoping to do it's going to be like a NESCAC event. So or not all, but as many NESCAC schools as we can get in June, in person, live, COVID notwithstanding. So hopefully that will be down the line. But if you haven't already, please gift someone a little Brocken Spectre. And thank you all for attending. Happy Sunday. And oh wait, is there another question? Let me know when that will be. Okay, yeah, okay. Thank you, Walter. Thank you. Thank you so much for attending, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Thank you all for being here.